Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said the phase of intense fighting against Hamas in Rafah is finally coming to an end. But he warned the war would not finish until the Islamist group no longer controls the Gaza Strip. In his first television interview on Israeli TV since the war started in October, Mr. Netanyahu said the end of the Rafah offensive would allow troops to be freed up to help in the northern border with Lebanon, where fighting with the Hezbollah armed group has escalated. Meanwhile, the Israeli Defence Minister Yoav Gallant has begun a visit to Washington, where he is due to hold talks about the conflict and with President Biden about a ceasefire deal. But Mr. Netanyahu said the main objective was still to destroy Hamas before the war concludes.
If there is an agreement, it will be an agreement according to our terms. And our terms are not to end the war, to leave Gaza and leave Hamas as it is. I refuse to leave Hamas as it is. We need to eliminate it.
Let's speak to Sebastian Usher now, who is in Jerusalem following developments there. Good to see you, Sebastian. So what more do we know about the Israeli government's plan now for Gaza and going forward?
Well, I think the message that Mr. Netanyahu was giving there to a domestic audience was one that we've already been hearing from the Israeli government, the Israeli military, over the past few weeks. But Rafah, they very much made out that this was the last major military operation that they were carrying out in Gaza, that was where they believe that the remaining Hamas battalions were, where hostages were potentially, and also where perhaps the leadership of Hamas in Gaza was based. That's continuing. We've had reports that Israeli tanks have been moving into the north and the west of Rafah. We've heard from the Hamas armed wing and Islamic Jihad that they have been fighting back with mortar bombs and with rocket-propelled grenades. And there's also fighting that's continuing in part of the centre of Gaza too, where Israel doesn't have full control of a particular area. And in Gaza City, we saw over the weekend that there were strikes on several locations. So this sense that Mr. Netanyahu is giving that the intense fighting is over in Gaza, that may well be true, but as he said, and as we've heard from all Israeli officials, the actual war in Gaza is not coming to an end. There's no sense that the mission that Mr. Netanyahu set himself is anywhere over. Key thing that he said was the redeployment of some of those troops to the northern border, where the battle with Hezbollah, which has stayed mostly within red lines of both sides, has again been escalating. And overnight, there were more Israeli strikes inside Lebanon on what they said were Hezbollah targets. You mentioned the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant. He's now in the US. One of the key things he's going to be talking about, where concern in the US and the rest of the world has been rising, is over what might happen between the Israeli forces and Hezbollah, and how that would involve the rest of Lebanon and potentially bring the region, as the concern has been, the wider region, more directly into the conflict. I think that concern is probably at its highest pitch at the moment.
And Sebastian, is there any sense of any return to talks when it comes to a hostage ceasefire deal?
Well, Mr. Netanyahu, again, he talked about that, but I mean, what he was saying was that he isn't accepting a ceasefire as things stand, which is a permanent ceasefire as a starting point. Now, that isn't what is in the current ceasefire proposal. That's a three-phase deal where confidence would be built up in the first phase, where there'd be a temporary ceasefire, talks would continue, and then hopefully in a second phase there would be a permanent ceasefire. Hamas, though, has continued to insist that it wants a permanent ceasefire to be nailed in from the start, and there has been a Hamas response to what Mr. Netanyahu said last night to Israeli TV, and saying that as far as they're concerned, that shows that Mr. Netanyahu is not interested in a ceasefire deal at the moment.
Okay, Sebastian.